Hello and welcome to the lecture series on basic cognitive processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. We have been talking about various cognitive functions in the last few lectures. Today I'll begin a series on the disorders of these cognitive functions that we've studied. Today's lecture will be about disorders of attention and perception, the cognitive functions we studied first of all during the beginning of the course. Now, some of you might ask that why there is a need to study a disorder, a machine that's not really working well, but the point is that a well functioning machine or a well functioning system does not really tell us a lot about how the machine would function, how the parts are related to each other, how they work together with each other, and those kind of things. It is sometimes only when a machine is broken you would actually realize that okay, part A is connected to part B in a particular manner, and those kind of things. Now, this is precisely why it is very important to study the cognitive functions and their disorders at the same point. So, what we will be trying to do in the lecture of today and the lecture after this one is basically covering the disorders associated with the cognitive functions that we have covered in this course. This will basically give us an idea about how the theories that we have been reading about pan out in real life scenarios where there are people who are afflicted with these disorders, and how do these theories help us understand those disorders, the causes of those disorders, also whether these theories can help us rehabilitate or help out these people who are suffering from these disorders. So, this is pretty much the basis or the pretty much the reason why I have included the disorders of these cognitive functions as the last two lectures of this particular course. So, today we will be talking about perception disorders and attention disorders. I will begin with a interesting disorder of perception, then maybe we will go on to a couple of disorders which have more to do with attention than perception per se. Now, having said that, let me begin with describing a very interesting case. So, have you ever wondered with questions, say questions like what color is number 7? Is number 7 of a particular color? Is number 3 or 4 of a particular color? What does Monday taste like? If somebody asks you that Tuesday tastes bitter or Monday tastes sweet, how would you really react to that? Things like, say for example, what would it mean to touch a particular color? So, these kind of questions might seem slightly metaphorical, slightly poetic to you, but you will be amazed to know that there are a class of people, there is a small minority of people that actually experiences these things. There is this class of people that actually experiences color whenever you mention to them a particular letter or a particular number. Now, these class of people are called synesthetes, persons having synesthesia. Now, what is synesthesia? Synesthesia basically is that condition wherein a person, if he or she is presented with a particular stimulus, might simultaneously and consistently experience another sensory event at the same point in time. So, when people with synesthesia are presented with a stimulus, they will tend to consistently and automatically all the time experience another sensory event. Whenever you mention a letter to this person, he will experience a color simultaneously, and the experience will be so joined that it would feel like that letters are of a particular color. There was this description in one of the books I have been reading. The material from here is basically inspired from David Groom's book, Introduction to Cognitive Psychology, Processes and Disorders, and one of the cases he mentions is basically about a particular child who comes back home from school and mentions to the parent that I have been having trouble with this yellow colored 7, or I have been having troubles with the blue colored 8, and the parent is kind of surprised at what this person is saying, and this child does not really know that it is a special condition. He would have been assuming that this is exactly what everybody feels like. So, interesting cases of synesthesia. You might actually things like YouTube and find so many videos have been compiled on the experience of synesthesia, on what it feels to be like to be a synesthete, and what do these different experiences actually involve. So, we will try and cover the theoretical and we will try and cover the demonstration part, the discussion part on synesthesia, while there might be a lot of videos you might find on the internet which will help you experience the condition more closely. Now, the commonly reported experiences in synesthesia include experiencing a color or seeing or hearing a letter or a number or even words for that matter. So, if you tell somebody about particular letters of the alphabet, they might report back experiencing colors simultaneously. If you are saying specific words, they might tell you that you are having this particular synesthetic experience at the same time. It could also be that some people might be linking colors with faces, days or weeks, but also things like they might say that I feel this sound in a particular way, or I see the musical notes in a particular way. Seeing taste and tasting colors, something like this. Baron Cohen and colleagues have done a lot of research in the area of synesthesia, and a lot of it is published. Some of the common papers are in 1996. Now, synesthetes, basically the people who have this exquisite ability, also report that inducers generally follow a reliable sequence. Particular kinds of letters will reliably produce very consistent color sequences. A particular kind of, say for example, if somebody is experiencing spatial arrangements, particular letters will induce very specific spatial arrangements at the same time. Now, early incidence of synesthesia, when it was first reported, was basically in a very famous paper by Baron Cohen and colleagues in 1987, and they were examining this synesthete called EP, who called herself an artist who has experienced lifelong condition of hearing words and sounds in color. So, this person actually, EP is an interesting tale. She has given out an advertisement in the newspaper asking people to come and explain the condition she was having. So, Baron Cohen basically tested and established the replicability of EP's synesthetic experiences, actually establishing that she was undergoing these experiences and that these experiences were consistent and automatic over a period of time. The comparison was typically like 100% of EP's synesthetic experiences were replicable. She could replicate and tell them constantly what she was experiencing, while only 17% of non-synesthetic controls could actually repeat that kind of a performance. Now, for many synesthetes, the color induced by the first letter determines the color of the entire word. Say for example, if you have a condition wherein you will see yellow color every time you come across the letter C, then any word that starts with C will be colored yellow for you. But with EP it was special in the sense that each letter of the word would induce separate colors, and she would actually experience the word as a mix of all of these colors. Now, this was interesting, and this test was basically done with her on pseudo words which do not have any meaning at all. So, you could just combine letters in a particular sequence that is pronunciable, but not really is a meaningful word. So, that was done. Now, we can talk about, let us proceed to talk about the nature of synesthesia. What is synesthesia actually like? Now, Mattingly and colleagues in 2001, they reported accuracy levels of around 80 to 100% in a group of 15 synesthetes compared with 30 to 35% in a group of 15 non-synesthetic controls in reporting the synesthetic experience. So, it has been again verified and multiple times reported that the people who are basically having this condition are almost 80 to 100% times accurate in the reporting of what they are actually feeling. Also, there were reports of a more the reports by synesthetes was more consistent over a longer period of 3 months test retest intervals as compared to that of non-synesthetic controls even after 1 month delay of testing. So, if you test synesthetes experience over a longer period of time for 3 months, and if you compare the non-synesthetes experience even after 1 month of time, there will be a lot of gap, there will be a lot of non-match between these performances. This kind of tells us that this experience is real and this experience is replicable, and the people are actually undergoing this particular experience. Now, synesthesia usually is a unidirectional process. Say for example, if a letter induces a particular color, the letter will consistently, automatically and always induce that particular color, but it is important to remember that the color will not induce memories of that letter. So, if you are seeing that color, say for example at some unrelated place, that color will not remind you of that letter. So inducers and targets. So there is this concept in synesthesia that there are inducers which induce the synesthetic experience, the simultaneous sensory experience of the other modality, but it does not really kind of transfer from target to the inducer. So synesthesia is a unidirectional process. For most synesthetes, simply imagining the inducer can also lead to synesthetic response. If I were a synesthete and I was thinking of the letter C or a letter P, and let us say, as I already said, letter C might induce a yellow color, letter P might induce a blue color. While saying this, while already even imagining these letters, I would assume to have this synesthetic experience of experiencing this color. Now, although synesthetic experiences are limited to a fairly low level perceptual state such as colors or spatial locations, rather than the appearance of a face or an object. So, they are basically very low level perceptual things, say things like color, spatial arrangements. Those are typically things that get associated with a particular synesthetic experience, not really very complex things like faces or objects or events and those kind of things. Also, some synesthetic experiences have also been linked to developmental experiences. So, some of these synesthetic experiences have been shown, and Withoft and Winauer basically in 2013 they linked consistent letter and color associations in 11 synesthetes to a Fisher-Price colored letter set. So, for example, these participants would have learned their letters, learned their alphabets through this Fisher-Price set is basically a set of toys which had colored letters, and probably these people recall seeing those letters in the specific colors produced by the Fisher-Price people, this is a toy company that is, and they kind of made those associations to such an extent that it led to the synesthesia happening. So, this link has also been made, however, there is nothing to suggest here that there is a causal relation, it is just a coincidental relation which has been traced by Withoft and Winauer in their 2013 paper. Now, Carpenter 2001 reports that most synesthetes regard their condition as a good thing. They do not really mind having that condition, they are not really particularly troubled by having that condition, though they also report one of the patients who said that this was becoming a problem for him to handle. For the most part, this is not really a debilitating experience of any kind. This is rather an experience that people have and they interpret it in various ways, but not really as rather troublesome. But one of the patients, as I already said, reported having some kind of trouble with this. Now, Stephen and Blakemore in 2004, they reported the details of 6 anesthetes who had experienced seeing colors on hearing or thinking about letters or numbers despite having been blind for a lot of years. So, they are not blind anymore, but they experienced seeing colors even though they did not really have a lot of experience in seeing colors for a long time. So, Stephen Blakemore basically commented that this suggests that synesthesia persists for very long periods of time with little or no natural experience in the referred modality. Now, let us talk about the incidence and the familiarity of synesthesia. Baron Cohen and colleagues in their 1996 paper estimated the incidence of synesthesia at about 1 in 2000 individuals, with about 80% of the patients being 80% of the affected being females. Ward in 2013 cites prevalence rates of 0.2% for the population. They could taste a shape, 1.4 for letter or number versus color synesthetes. These people will experience color when they will hear a particular letter or a particular number, and up to 20% for those who image sequences into spatial arrays, suggesting that an approximately equal number of men and women both have synesthetic experience. So, this last kind of people, they will actually put events in a spatial arrangement that X happened first and then Y happened, and they all arrange all of their experiences in a spatial manner. So, these are the different kind of synesthesias possible, and we also discussed about the kind of incidence rates for these synesthesias. Now, there have been a lot of experimental research with synesthesia since this is an interesting phenomena itself. So, several researchers basically have used the versions of the Stroop test proposed by J.R. Stroop in 1935 to investigate the occurrence of synesthesia. If just to remind you, Stroop test is basically wherein you are asked to name letters which are in some colored ink. You are asked to read these words out, and say, for example, it could be a blue written in a green ink, it could be green written in a blue ink, and so when you are reading blue and one of the things is asked, so you can either be asked to read the letter or you can either be asked to name the color of the ink. And because these two informations are both automatic, you will see the color immediately and you will read the word immediately. There is a conflict between these two sources of information, and participants have reported slowing down in naming these colored words because of this interference. Now, how does that map on to synesthesia? Let us see. Typically, a synesthete is asked to identify the actual color of a series of stimuli. So, there will be colored words or colored letters or numbers, and these participants will ask to tell what the color of these stimuli are. Now, some of these stimuli are actually inducers, so they will induce some different colors. So, there could be a letter, let us say there could be a word called cap, and cap basically will induce a yellow color because C stands for yellow, as we have been talking about. Now, when the inducer color, say for example, matches the synesthetic colors, the word is written in yellow and it induces the yellow color itself, then the responses will be significantly faster compared to when the inducer color is different and the stimuli is of a different color. So, this basically, the second part, will interfere with the performance, and the responses are found to be significantly slower than on neutral trials. So, this is something which they found out, and these findings are taken to suggest that synesthesia is something that cannot be switched off. It is almost as automatic as reading a word when you are presented with the word, and hence they are termed as mandatory processes or automatic processes. Now, Mattingly and colleagues in 2001, they modified the Stroop task a bit to investigate whether the conscious processing of an inducer is necessary for a synesthetic response. Now, see, we have been talking about when a person comes across an inducer, a target synesthetic experience is generated almost automatically, consistently and all the time. Now, they wanted to test whether it is necessary to consciously perceive the inducer. If the inducer is presented in such a way that you cannot consciously perceive it, whether it would still cause the synesthetic experience. So, what they did was that they presented inducers very briefly followed by a visual mask. So, let us say for a period of around 35 to 50 milliseconds, below which it is not possible to consciously experience something, and then you hide this off with a particular mask that comes after it. So, it is known now that such brief and masked presentations are registered in the brain at some level, but they can influence the responses of the participants in ways which we have discussed earlier in priming studies, etc. Now, this technique incidentally prevents conscious awareness of these kind of stimuli which you are presenting, and neither the synesthetes nor the control participants in this kind of arrangement were able to report what they had seen. So, they are not really conscious of whatever was presented to them. Under these kind of conditions, no synesthetic interference was found. None of these individuals also reported having a synesthetic experience of any kind. So, it was concluded, and reliably so, that conscious awareness is therefore necessary for the synesthetic experience to occur. So, we know a few things of synesthesia by now, that it is a automatic mandatory process, it cannot be switched off, it is consistent, happens all the time, and now also we know that the inducers need to be consciously perceived for synesthesia to occur. Such a finding has also been supported by studies that have used visual search paradigms. So, when asked to search for a red F among blue letters, synesthetes did not have any added advantage, as a blue F will not pop out because of their experience of the letter as red. Okay. So, in a visual search scenario, the property of that letter being an inducer also does not make it stand out in any sense. It does not lead to any significant advantage per se. It also suggests that conscious attention to the inducer is therefore necessary before the synesthetic experience can actually set in. In visual search scenarios, you will see a lot of time your search is not really consciously, you are probably looking at one thing, but you are in a covert attention way looking at some other things as well. Now, let us talk about a few brain imaging studies of synesthesia. Just to revise, fMRI or functional brain imaging techniques basically allow the researchers to examine changes in the measure of brain function as volunteers perform different tasks. Areas that are predominantly active during any of these tasks receive more oxygenated blood, and which can be tracked, and hence one can generate a spatial map of brain function. Say for example, if there is the fusiform gyrus which is known to be involved in face recognition, that is the area which will start receiving more blood, and there are ways to trace more blood in a particular area as compared to less blood in other areas. Other ways is EEG, electroencephalography, or ERP, event related potentials. These methods record very minute changes in a voltage detectable from electrodes that are rested on the participant's scalp, and these measures are very sensitive to millisecond level changes that are happening in brain's processing. So they give us a very good temporal resolution of how processing in the brain is happening, though they are not really able to give us a very good spatial resolution of where this processing is happening. So there is a second thing. We have probably done all of this in the methods part. I am just kind of doing a revision here. Now transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, is also one of these methods that allows of some inference of the functional involvement of the brain areas. So what happens here is there is an electromagnetic coil that is placed on the scalp to induce an electrical pulse in the underlying cortical region. So it is basically a coil and you place it on the head and it kind of induces a magnetic field in the cortical region. Now what this does is it leads to either excitation or inhibition of that particular cortical area, and can be used to either test the excitability or the involvement of that area in any given task, which we will give to the participant after that. Now there have been studies using these kind of methods with the synesthetes, and one of them I will just mention. So Nunn and colleagues in 2002, they used fMRI to report that synesthetes showed increased activity in the area V4 of the occipital lobe, and this area V4 is basically the region that is connected with color perception. And when this activation was found, when these participants were actually listening to the inducer compared to the non-inducer version. If you are listening to these letters and if you are a synesthete, there is a certain activity actually going on in the color perceiving areas of your brain, verifying for the fact that you are actually experiencing those colors. Now this signal was not found in non-synesthetic control participants who had also been asked to associate colors and words. So it is not something that you can learn and start having an experience of. It is something that is a condition and that is there by itself. You cannot really learn to have synesthesia for that matter. These kind of consistent findings were also supported by Hubbard and Ramachandran in their paper in 2005. Now these findings tell us something about the synesthetic color experience, and they tell us that it basically is based on the real experience of color. It is not that somebody is associating a particular letter with a particular color. It is actually happening in the brain. When you listen to that letter, you do experience that color very reliably. Some of the other studies have also failed to detect similar activity, and there are suggestions that different forms of synesthesia may be associated with different patterns. So again, these kind of linkages with the brain and with these areas of synesthesia are also have also been established. Now coming to summing up what synesthesia was about, let us talk a little bit about the theories that have attempted to explain synesthesia. One of these theories maintains that all of us were synesthetes at one point in time during early stages of childhood, when say for example we were growing up, but we lose these connections between these different sensory experiences during the course of development, probably because these are unadaptive and they are not fruitful for any meaningful interaction with the world. Ramachandran and Hubbard point out that the brain areas involved in color perception, areas like V4, are actually immediately adjacent to the areas involved or areas that become active during reading of letters. It might be just a coincidence, or it might not be a coincidence that these areas are very close together. Grosenbacher and Lovelace, they basically put forward a particular hypothesis called the disinhibited feedback theory, and the disinhibited feedback theory proposes that connections between different sensory pathways exist in normal brains, but that the activity of these pathways is usually inhibited to prevent unadaptive crosstalk between these sensory channels. Interesting evidence has been reported about this disinhibition hypothesis. Say for example, Newfield and colleagues in 2001 found no difference between the 14 auditory visual synesthetes and 14 non-synesthetic participants using fMRI in terms of the functional connectivity between the auditory and visual areas, but they found greater connectivity between the sensory areas and the IPS in the synesthetic group, suggesting that it may be the links via this integration area, that is the IPS, that are suppressed in non-synesthetes but are not suppressed in synesthetes, and that is what is allowing them to have this multimodal multi-sensory experience. Now we have talked a little bit about synesthesia, let us move our attention to a different kind of a disorder. Again, synesthesia was a disorder of perception. There is another disorder called blindsight. Now, Popple and colleagues in 1973, they were studying a group of ex-servicemen who had suffered visual field deficits as a result of gunshot wounds to their extrastriate or striate cortex and to their striate cortex. And they asked these participants to make judgments about the correct location of a flash of light presented to their blind sight. So, the idea was that these people have lost sight in a particular visual field because of the injury in the striate cortex, and then what these people are asked to do is that people will show a flash of light in the blind region and they will be asked to detect it or try to detect it. Now, as these servicemen could not see the flashes, the light was paired with the sound of a buzzer, and on hearing the buzzer, these people were asked to move their eyes in the direction to which the flashlight was. While the servicemen found this a very difficult task, almost all of them were able to gaze their eyes to move their gaze towards the light, which basically they cannot see. So, this was a very interesting phenomena. How are these people being able to move their eyes to the direction of the flash, even though they cannot really see the flash? So, the buzzer is just a hint that there will be a light flash, but it does not in any way tell you about the location of the flash. So, these people are in some ways being able to decipher where these flashes of light are occurring, even in their blind visual field. Now, Weisskranz in 1974, he describes a patient DB who seemed to demonstrate the same kind of a remarkable ability. He could report the details of objects appearing in the blind areas of his visual field despite having no conscious experience of seeing them. So, if let us say if this person is blind in the right visual field, if you keep an object somewhere there, this person after some time will be able to tell you what have you kept or the general shape and whether this is moving or not, those kind of things, even though he is reliably shown to be blind in this area completely. Now, they did this series of experiments, Weisskranz and colleagues, they did this series of experiments with DB, and they basically systematically were trying to investigate the perceptual abilities preserved in the blind areas of DB. So, DB, it was found that DB was able to detect the presence of an object, indicate its location in space by pointing. He could also discriminate between moving and stationary objects, horizontal and vertical lines, and could also even distinguish the letter X from O if it was presented in the blind area. Now, this is something completely interesting. So, Weisskranz basically named this phenomena as blindsight. Let us talk about blindsight a bit more. Covey in 2004 summarized the arguments put forward by skeptics such as Campion et al. So, a lot of people were actually skeptical about whether blindsight is a real phenomena at all. So, people like Campion and colleagues, they basically favored what is called the stray light explanation. So, they said that these participants are basically being able to detect these objects in the blind visual field because of stray light that is reflecting from around the areas and falling in the region where they can see. So, the stray light hypothesis goes like this. Campion and colleagues, they favored the stray light explanation of blindsight, which suggested that the blindsight patients responded to light reflected from the object onto the functioning areas of the vision. So, this is what the stray light explanation is. Now, they were describing a patient who reported that he actually used such a strategy to distinguish between a vertical and horizontal bars presented to the blind areas of his visual field. Now, this patient claimed that he could see a faint glow in the preserved areas of the visual field and used this cue to undertake this particular task. So, it could be shown that people are not entirely blind and they are not being they are not really using the blind area to decipher where the light flash is. They are actually using light reflected from a different source and using that as a cue to actually guess where this where this light flash will be. Now, Campion and colleagues demonstrated that such a strategy could actually be used and could be utilized to get an accurate localization of a light in a blind area of a person's visual field of normal subjects whose vision had been masked. So, you put a mask on these people's vision and you will see that these people can also use this stray light to locate these things. However, some of the explanations given by these the stray light theorists did not really hold up, as they could not explain DB's ability to distinguish between letters such as X and O or two different spatial frequency gratings with the same average brightness. In addition, DB could also locate objects even against a rather bright background, wherein you will not really be able to use this stray light explanation very favorably. So, whereas Campion's normal subjects could only locate this light source against a low level background illumination. So, if there is a flash of light and you can locate it even against a bright background, it tells you that you are probably not using the reflection of the light. Another theory which talks about blind sight was given by Weisinger and colleagues in 1997, and they suggested that blind sight was attributable to small areas or islands in the scotoma. Scotoma is basically the areas of blindness in the visual field, within which vision is spared, and that blind sight may be mediated by what is left of the primary visual pathway rather than other secondary pathways. So, they are saying that there might be areas in the blind part which are partially preserved or partially still active, and participants can be using these partially preserved areas to guess where these light flashes are or where these different objects are. Now, Kentridge and colleagues, on the other hand, they tested this suggestion while looking for scattered regions of spared vision in a patient using a procedure that ensured no effects of eye movement. So, this person basically, so Kentridge and colleagues basically wanted to test this proposal, and they actually went out and tested this with particular people. They found out, Kentridge and colleagues, they noted that blind sight does not extend across the whole area of the scotoma, but was evident in only some areas even after eye movements had been eliminated. So, again there is particular areas in the scotoma, particular areas in the blind region wherein the blind sight is actually active. Are these the same areas wherein the people are experiencing something, or is the spared island island thing true? So, this could not lead to the conclusion that even though there might be some spared islands of vision within the scotoma, these areas could not account for all phenomena in blind sight. They could not allow accounting for movement or other things like that. In 2004, also reported results from an fMRI study where an fMRI scanning of several blind sight patients could not show a single shred of evidence for sparing of the striate cortex in the area of the scotoma. Even then, these people were not were able to detect objects in their blind region, and hence were patients of blind sight. Coming to the final words, just coming to what blind sight is about. So, one of the possible explanations or implications of blind sight that have been put forward is that we have two separate visual systems, one a slightly primitive non-striate system that does not really build upon the striate cortex area, and a more advanced striate system that is the enhanced area wherein we do all kinds of complex calculations. The primitive non-striate system might be sensitive to movement, speed and other potentially important basic low level characteristics without even giving rise to conscious perception. So, these calculations are so low level or so simple or initial to do that they do not really need to be consciously known that you are calculating the motion or you are calculating the shape or color, etc. The other similar explanation was that the striate and non-striate systems have evolved for different roles. For example, the striate system has evolved to allow for the identification of an object, whereas the non-striate system has just evolved for the localization of an object. And it is possible that what is happening during blind sight is that only the striate system is damaged, whereas the non-striate system remains active and remains preserved, and that non-striate system is basically leading to the incidences of blind sight in patients having scotoma, patients having blind regions because of damage to the striate cortex. This was all about blind sight. We've talked about disorders of perception, we've talked about synesthesia, we've talked about blind sight. Let us now turn towards disorders which might more be disorders of attention than perception. So, one of these very interesting disorders that one comes across is the disorder called unilateral spatial neglect. There are other names for the same disorder as well, say for example hemi-attention or contralateral neglect or spatial neglect, etc. Now, what happens in this particular disorder? In unilateral spatial neglect, that is what we will refer this as USN, patients do fail to respond to stimuli which they can actually see. So, there could be a patient who has a normal vision, but but still fails to react to objects or events to one side of the space. Hence, this is termed unilateral. Say for example, there could be a patient who is having some deficit in the left part of the brain and will basically neglect everything that is forming in the right visual field. Even though the visual apparatus is completely intact, even though everything is actually seen, but the patient do not interact with that object, they do not report seeing that object, they completely report being oblivious to that object's presence. So, you can see here, this is a drawing by a patient of unilateral spatial neglect, and you will see that if you ask this person to draw a clock, this person draws all the numbers only to one side of the visual field and does not draw anything to the other side. It is not that the eyes are not working, again it is not a disorder of visual perception, it is basically that this person is not being able to attend anything that is on the contralateral visual field. This is what is called unilateral spatial neglect. Now, the main cause of unilateral spatial neglect is a stroke or hemorrhage, which is basically an interruption to the brain's blood supply. Up to 84% of patients with damage to the right hemisphere of the brain from stroke will show evidence of ignoring information on the left side of their visual field. Similarly, up to 64% of the patients with damage to the left hemisphere could show the opposite pattern. They will start ignoring information on the right hemisphere. Now, for some reason, and it has been shown that the left neglect following right hemisphere damage is markedly more severe and persistent than is right neglect following left hemisphere damage, because probably the right hemisphere still does some of the remaining processing. Now, patients with USN, unilateral spatial neglect, may fail to notice an object in clear view on the left side. They ignore people approaching from the left side, they would eat food only from the left side of the plate, they would basically dress only the right side of the body. There was interesting anecdotes about USN you might find in a lot of books on neuropsychology, that there was this patient who was suffering from unilateral spatial neglect. Every time he would go on to shave or go on to dress himself, he will just shave one side of the face and wear shirt or pant only on one side of the body and not on the other side. It's because this person is not being able to attend to anything that is on the contralateral hemifield. Now, USN, if you kind of dwell on the kind of description I have given of this particular disorder, may impact people's daily living, may exclude them from rehabs, and is associated with longer hospital stays and dependence on the other. If a person is not capable of really looking at anything on one entire side of the visual field, obviously the person would need a lot of help, even doing daily chores like brushing their teeth or shaving and things like that. A disorder of attention. So, there has been considerable debate about this as well. So, USN seems to be a failure of or a difficulty in responding to information on one side of the space that cannot be explained by any sensory loss. There is no basic sensory loss here, the visual systems are intact and functioning normally. Now, the obvious difference between unilateral spatial neglect and visual field loss is that the former can exert influence on across modalities, that is the USN can actually exist across modalities, hearing might also be affected, listening might also be affected, while the visual field loss, things like in blindsight, is basically limited to one modality only. Now, USN has been, as I was saying, reported in audition, tactile exploration, touching, body sensation, etc. While visual field losses are strictly retinotopic, USN varies in different spatial frameworks, that is it may occur from objects to the left side of the body or for objects on the left side of a particular something. Say for example, if I am looking at a particular car, I might not see the left side of the car but only the right side of the car. So, it can be in that sense as well. Now, USN may occur for the left side of each object within a scene. So, if you are actually a patient of USN, you are looking at a particular painting, you might not be able to see anything on the right side of the painting. Or say for example, if you are if you are having right hemisphere damage, you will not be able to see anything on the left side of the painting. Now, Marshall and Halligan in 1993, they describe how patients kept on drawing pictures only of the left side of the plants when asked to copy pictures. So, they gave people these drawings to copy, and they would consistently only copy the left side of the plants but not the right side, because they are not being able to see that. Is USN again a disorder of attention? Patients have been shown to attend to the left if cued to do so. So, this is interesting because the visual sensory system is working fine. If you can somehow get them to attend to this neglect site, they have been shown to be able to attend that. This is something which will kind of establish that this is more a disorder of attention than perception. Also, if a stimulus appears in face of a competition with a within a rival with a rival in the good side, then it is inevitably ignored. So, if for example you are giving two stimuli to people, one is on the left side, one is on the right side, and the left side is your neglected side. If you could draw the attention to the left side, the person might be able to see it, but if at the same time there is a competing object on the good side, that is the right side, this competition will lead to this ignored part being ignored permanently. Now, there seems to be a gradient also between the left to right, and there is no clear boundary. Say for example, till a particular point the person will see, after that the the acuity or the experience of that object will be going on and tapering off. So, there have been a lot of studies, say for example case studies by Bessiash and Losati in 1978. What they did was they asked the patients to describe, say describe the Piazza del Duomo, which is a famous landmark in Milan, and they basically were asked to describe these things or draw these things from memory. Now, interesting thing was they could describe the landmarks on their right, but when they were asked to describe the same landmark from the other end, so say for example the situation was stand on the north corner and explain and describe all the landmarks. So, these people will describe everything on the right from the north. Once they had given all of these descriptions, they were said change the ends, go to the south end and again describe whatever you see. This time whatever landmarks they had left in the previous description came to the senses and they could actually describe the entire thing. So, this is again a demonstration of this being more a matter of attention than perception. It is due to something that is wrong with the brain that these objects to this contralateral hemifield is completely ignored or completely missed and cannot even be accessed by memory. Marshall and Halligan, they also did a very similar demonstration with the USN patients, wherein basically they say that this seems to be having similar findings, that this seems to be more of a disorder of attention than visual perception. What could be the possible rehabilitation process in USN? So, we could encourage patients to look towards and be aware of the left side, and that has basically not really been able to produce a lot of outcomes. Though however, the movement of the left arm or some kind of movement in the left visual field has led to participants being able to attend to things in the neglected visual field as well. Let us try and explain what USN is about. So, USN basically occurs at a remarkably high frequency following stroke and has also been reported following damage to a wide variety of brain areas, including the parietal, temporal and frontal lobes, even also subcortical areas. Now, this has led to the idea that normal spatial attention may reflect a dynamic and easily disruptive competitive balance between the widely distributed networks in the hemisphere. So, it says that all of these areas of visual processing, perceptual processing and memory, they are competing within the two hemispheres. So, in this view what they say is that the left hemisphere is pushing attention towards the right space, whereas the right hemisphere is pushing attention towards the left space, and in a normal individual this is balanced so that you get to attend both the spaces. In unilateral spatial neglect, what happens is we are not really just seeing the effect of the lesioned right hemisphere or the lesioned left hemisphere, but also its exaggeration due to the fact that the good hemisphere, the intact hemisphere is kind of suppressing everything out of that particular visual field. So, its exaggeration due to the suppressing effects of the undamaged hemisphere is basically probably leading to this kind of neglect of this particular hemifield. Now, let us come to a third disorder, visual agnosia. Agnosia basically comes from a Greek word. Agnosia means no knowledge. So, visual agnosia is no knowledge visually of something. Now, patients with visual agnosia are not really blind and the sensory processes are usually intact. However, the condition refers to an impairment in the ability to visually recognize objects. This might also be coming out as a disorder of attention and perception. Now, they can move around and navigate spatially. Everything is fine. They can also recognize objects via other modalities. Say for example, there was a patient when she was asked to look at a candle and tell what this is, name the object, she was not being able to do that. But if she was asked to take the candle in the hand, touch it and tell what this candle is, she could do it perfectly well. So, these people just cannot recognize objects visually. That is why the disorder is termed as visual agnosia. Now, two kinds are proposed: apperceptive agnosia and associative agnosia. Someone suffering from apperceptive agnosia can be thought to have a normal visual acuity with an inability to draw an object, or to say whether two similar objects are the same or different, or even to describe the components of this object. So, they are not being able to build the percept in the first place. Someone on the other hand suffering from associative agnosia would be able to draw an object or match similar objects to this particular object, and would also be able to describe the components of this particular object, but they would be unable to recognize the objects that they had just seen or drawn. So, in these people, the problem is not with creating a percept, but the problem is with associating the percept to whatever knowledge that the person already has. So, herein you can see the drawings of apperceptive agnosia patients. So, they are not really even being able to draw these very simple figures that would be otherwise rather easy to do from the perspective of normal individuals. Now, Lazare in 1890 proposed that these two stages, apperceptive and associative agnosia, are rather hierarchical and sequential in the first place. So, he says that in the apperceptive stage of perception, the elements or the components of the objects are established, and then in the associative stage, these are integrated to form particular objects and then linked to the knowledge, which will help you identify and recognize these objects. This would mean that the patients with pure apperceptive agnosia have an intact store of knowledge about objects, but they are unable to distinguish the shape of the objects because they are unable to identify the objects visually. They are not being able to create that percept to link to that knowledge. But patients with pure associative agnosia are rather able to perceive the objects, but are often able to identify them. Now, this principle was found useful in differentiating the patients with pure apperceptive or associative agnosia, and those who could, say for example, the idea could be that those who could not copy had the apperceptive agnosia, those who could at least copy but could not name had associative agnosia. Now, there could also be related forms: form agnosia, integrative agnosia. Form agnosia is basically very similar to what apperceptive agnosia is like. So, it is used for patients who are unable to discriminate between objects, who are unable to copy line drawings of objects. Again, it comes out of the research for Farah in 2004. Integrative agnosia is basically a term which is used nowadays for associative agnosia, and this term reflects the actual difficulties, the processing difficulties that these patients are facing. So, it is used to refer to patients who can perceive the individual shapes, who can kind of create the percept, but they cannot integrate these shapes into a representation of a whole object. Say for example, if you are showing this person a particular, let us say a television, he might be able to get this rectangle shape and the square shape and those kind of things, but will not be able to integrate these shapes to form the particular object, and hence he will not be able to name that object. Now, how would be life with visual agnosia? Patients, say for example like AJA, which was reported by Humphreys and Riddoch, with visual form agnosia actually experience a very confused and a distorted visual world in which almost everything feels distorted. Nothing seems really familiar, and even basic forms are indistinguishable from each other because they are just geometric shapes, line drawings, lines and forms all mixed up into each other, nothing really identifying itself as a unique object. It is almost like looking at the world through a very powerful microscope, wherein despite seeing all the details of everything that is around you, it is hard to put together a mental picture of these objects. Now, Goodale and Milner, they describe such a patient, Miss D, who had severe visual form agnosia as a result of carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, despite being unable to recognize visual objects from their shape, she could use the surface characteristics like texture and color to help recognize objects. So, other modalities are working completely fine, it is just that they are not being able to associate or integrate this information visually. Also, there could be a difference in perception between animate versus inanimate objects. So, a patient was named SA who could identify animate objects much better than the inanimate objects, while another patient AJA could identify inanimate objects much better than the animate objects. So, these kind of dissociations have also been reported. Similarly, other patient, JBR, could name the line drawings of many non-living objects such as a spade or a hairbrush or hammers, things like that, but he could not name the line drawings of living things, say for example such as a dog or a fly or musical instruments such as trumpet, and this is reported by the studies of Warrington and Challis in 1984. Now, Farah and McClelland in 1991 argued that there is a difference between identifying a living person versus a non-living person, and this difference basically this difference which is being coming out might just be an artifact. So, they are saying that in most cases, whenever there is impaired knowledge of perceptual attributes with intact knowledge of functional attributes, there is also an impairment for inanimate objects. So, this impairment in recognizing inanimate objects is not really a perceptual impairment or attentional impairment, it is basically an impairment that you do not know about the perceptual attributes, but you at least know about the function part. Now, because perceptual attributes are crucial for identifying animate objects, the identification of inanimate objects is crucially linked to the functional attributes in semantic memory. Now, coming towards the end, talking about prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia is basically a form of agnosia that relates to faces. The term prosopagnosia was first used by Bodemer in 1947, who examined 10 patients who he believed showed a face-specific deficit. So, these people were not able to recognize non-face faces, but they were able to recognize non-face objects completely normally. People with prosopagnosia cannot even recognize familiar faces of family members, friends, or even themselves in the mirror, though their visual and sensory processes otherwise for all other classes of objects are working completely fine. However, individuals with prosopagnosia are often able to use other cues such as voice recognition to recognize familiar people. It just means that the identity and the semantic information has not been lost, it is just that the visual association of the face is gone. Bruce and Young did a lot of work with prosopagnosia, and they used this evidence gained from studying individuals and from studies of normal individuals as well to produce a model of face processing. The model suggests that the recognition of identity and expression, facial speech analysis are independent processes, and subsequent evidence from different brain damaged patients have actually supported this particular view. So, this is the model here. It shows that expression analysis, facial speech analysis, or face recognition unit, or say for example viewer centered descriptions of faces are all independent things. Identity is an independent process, and all of these kind of operate in cooperation with each other to get you the overall percept of somebody's face, though they are functionally rather independent of each other. Now, given that face recognition is one of the most demanding and sophisticated tasks that our visual system undertakes, it is completely unsurprising that an impairment in this ability can be acquired through brain damage. So, there has to be something wrong with the brain for this kind of deficit to emerge. However, brain damage rarely leads to complete destruction of the ability to recognize faces. There is a lot of variation in the severity of impairment into the kind of experience that these patients of prosopagnosia are having. Also, they might have different levels of preserved skills of facial processing as well, and it is not completely gone. Now, living with prosopagnosia. So, data from imaging studies has also demonstrated that most cases of prosopagnosia have found to have damage in the fusiform and the lingual gyri, although there are cases of damage in the more anterior temporal area. Face recognition has also been shown as a key, and the fusiform area has also been shown as a key structure in face and object processing in numerous other studies, and it has been shown that an area in the fusiform gyrus, typically now known as the fusiform face area, is a critical region in recognizing faces. There is this variability, however, in the location of the fusiform face area in individuals, and this may help to explain why prosopagnosia sometimes seems to occur with damage only in one of the hemispheres. Now, such variation has led researchers to think that there is no single area in the brain that is responsible for processing faces. Rather, a distributed neural network of areas composed of many bilateral regions is involved in perceiving faces. Barton 2008 reviewed data from 10 patients, and they concluded that severe impairments were found in patients with the in the bilateral occipitotemporal lesions involving the fusiform gyrus, which had led to prosopagnosia. Also, he concluded that the right fusiform gyrus was involved in the configural processing of faces, and that memory for faces were more severely disrupted when these bilateral lesions also included the right anterior temporal lobe. So, again you can see that these different areas are involved in different ways in processing of faces, because face generally is a slightly complex percept. Now, is prosopagnosia a face specific disorder? Redock and colleagues in 2008, they studied the patient FB and they found that she was unable to identify faces of famous people and those she was actually previously familiar with, but could make age, gender and expression judgments. Also, she could learn object names almost as fast as other controls. So, it could be safely concluded from the studies on FB that she demonstrates a relatively pure form of prosopagnosia. Everything else is intact, all other abilities are intact, only the ability of recognizing faces is suffering. So, that is why this was regarded as a pure form of prosopagnosia. Now, McNeil and Warrington in 1993, they describe a case of WJ who took up farming and became a prosopagnostic and remarkably showed the evidence of being able to recognize his sheep despite being remaining prosopagnostic to human faces. Asal also described a farmer who was initially unable to recognize either humans or cows, but after 6 months regained the ability to recognize humans but not cows. Duchesne and Garrido also report that these kind of dissociations are not really enough to provide a support for face specificity for prosopagnosia. So, this is all about disorders. We have covered quite a few disorders both of attention and perception in this study. I hope this would help you gain some insight into the theories that we have studied earlier and try and link those and you could try to link those theories with the kind of experience that these disorders have described. Thank you.